Every passing minute seemed an eternity within the bleak, uninviting confines of the jail's bullpen. The stale air was a persistent reminder of Lamont's current reality, a suffocating mix of unwashed bodies, moldy food, and the revolting, omnipresent odor of the clogged toilet. The inmates' complaints had fallen on deaf ears, the guards shrugging off their pleas with indifferent smirks. The toilet, now a ticking time bomb of filth, served as a stark reminder of their plight and as a catalyst for an ever-rising wave of tension among the inmates. One sweltering afternoon, as the stagnant air of the bullpen clung to their skin like a damp shroud, an audacious newcomer, a burly man with a shaved head and tattoos coiling up his muscular arms, decided to brave the dreaded toilet. An immediate uproar ensued. Protests erupted like a string of firecrackers, raw voices echoing through the room, each one harsher than the last. "Man, you can't do that. It's gonna overflow." One inmate, a thin man with sharp features, barked out, his body tensed and ready for conflict. "Who's gonna stop me?" "You," the burly man retorted, a sneer tugging at his lips. His challenging gaze swept across the room, daring any soul to contest him. With that, the fuse was lit. A whirlwind of heated words, glaring stares, and clenched fists swept through the bullpen. Insults were slung like punches. Tension simmered to boiling point, and the room teetered on the precipice of a full-blown brawl. Just as a volatile standoff seemed inevitable, the older man Lamont had met on his first day stood up. With an air of calm authority, he mediated, using reason and persuasion, diffusing the explosive situation. In the midst of the ensuing calm, Lamont felt a cold reality wash over him. These minor irritations, petty squabbles, and seemingly insignificant difficulties were not just passing discomforts, but a test of his endurance and resilience. As the bullpen resumed its restless hum, Lamont sunk deeper into his corner, the echoes of the recent argument still ringing in his ears. A new day awaited, promising another test of his endurance, another grim chapter in his unexpected saga of incarceration. Lamont had been in the bullpen for a few hours now, and he was beginning to get used to the routine. He had made some acquaintances with the other inmates, but he had also made some enemies. One of them was a man called Big Joe. As the day wore on, the heat inside the bullpen became stifling. The inmates grew restless and irritable, and the slightest thing could set them off. Big Joe was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Lamont tried not to pay attention, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Suddenly, without warning, Big Joe lunged at another inmate. The other man, caught off guard, stumbled backward and fell to the ground. Big Joe was on top of him in an instant, shouting obscenities and throwing punches. The other inmates tried to separate them, but it was no use. The brawl quickly escalated, and fists were flying everywhere. Lamont did his best to stay out of the way, but he wasn't quick enough. A stray punch landed on his cheek, and he felt a sharp pain shoot through his face. He stumbled backward, clutching his cheek. The fight continued to rage on around him, and Lamont felt completely helpless. Just as things seemed to be getting out of hand, the guards finally arrived. They stormed into the bullpen, shouting for the inmates to stop fighting. It took several minutes, but eventually they were able to break up the brawl. Several of the inmates were bleeding and injured, and the entire place was a mess. Lamont sat down on a nearby bench, trying to catch his breath. He felt a throbbing pain in his cheek where he'd been punched. He looked around at the chaos that surrounded him, and he couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up in this place. It was well past midnight, and the bullpen was quiet, save for the occasional snore that echoed off the concrete walls. Lamont lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, grateful for the chance to catch some much-needed sleep. His eyes were just starting to drift shut when a sudden, thunderous sound jolted him awake. It was a fart, loud and long, and the stench that followed was so overpowering that Lamont's eyes watered. He heard the groans and gagging of his fellow inmates as they covered their noses and tried to escape the smell. "Damn, man, that's nasty," Lamont exclaimed, holding his breath. But the inmate responsible for the foul odor just laughed and let out another loud fart. Lamont could feel the heat rising in his face. He tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the stench was so strong that it made his stomach turn. The odor lingered for what felt like hours, and it was impossible for anyone to get any rest. Eventually, one of the inmates started banging on the bars of the cell, shouting for the guard to let them out. "I can't take this shit no more," he screamed. But the guard ignored them, telling them to shut up and deal with it. The smell was so noxious that Lamont felt like he was suffocating. He tried to cover his face with his shirt, but it didn't help much. The rest of the night was a blur of misery as they all suffered in the cloud of gas. By the time morning finally came, everyone was exhausted and irritable. Lamont stumbled out of his bunk, rubbing his bleary eyes and coughing. He promised himself that if he ever got out of this place, he would never take fresh air for granted again. Lamont sat on the hard concrete bench, his eyes fixed on the two inmates in the center of the bullpen, who were now screaming insults at each other. He had seen his fair share of fights during his time in prison, but this one seemed different. The tension in the air was palpable, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. As the two men got closer, Lamont could see the veins bulging in their necks, and he could hear the thud of their fists connecting with each other's bodies. The other inmates were now shouting and egging them on, their eyes wild with excitement. Some were even placing bets on who would win. Lamont knew he had to do something before it got out of hand. He stood up and tried to push his way through the crowd, but they just shoved him back, telling him to mind his own business. He tried to reason with them, but they were too caught up in the moment to listen. The two combatants were now rolling on the floor, grappling with each other, their faces contorted in rage. Lamont could hear bones cracking and skin tearing as they continued to fight. He winced as one of them landed a brutal punch on the other's face, sending blood splattering across the floor. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the bullpen, and the inmates froze. The guards had arrived, and everyone knew that this was bad news. Lamont could feel his heart racing as the guards stormed in, batons at the ready. In a matter of seconds, the fight was over. The guards dragged the two combatants away, leaving behind a bloody mess. The other inmates slunk back to their seats, muttering under their breaths. Lamont sat back down on the bench, his head in his hands. He knew that things could have ended much worse if the guards hadn't intervened.